Okay, everybody, welcome to the first lecture in our new module, Module 3, which is focused on sex, gender, and anthropology. So in this kind of module, we're going to go over a lot of different kind of angles on the question of what is the relationship between sex, gender, and sexuality, and what are some of the various different ways that anthropologists have tried to get at this, whether it's biological anthropologists, like Helen Fisher talking about gender roles and how that relates to love. Or today, like we're going to talk about differences between sex and gender and how drag queens and other notions and other people who blend the boundaries between sexuality and gender identities challenge our conceptions to things like the missing and murder Indigenous women's and girls crisis, which is talking about particular types of gendered violence and oppression that people in our societies experience. So let's dive into it. So we readily accept that clothing, language, and music are pretty culturally dependent, right? But we often find it difficult to accept that gender and sexuality are not natural. In reality, human sexuality is one of the most culturally significant, shaped, regulated, and symbolic things of all human capacities. In this section of the course, we're going to reflect on the ways in which sex, gender, and sexuality is deeply embedded and shaped by our culture. So I want to start off just with a question for the class, which is what are some of the ways in which gender norms play out in daily life? So take a couple minutes if you're watching this at home and write down some ideas. This is going to come back into play during your third writing commentary. And if you're in class, we'll talk about it. So the primary explanation of our kind of cultural differences between males and females is that they're kind of hardwired differently. Differences in sex, basically the reproductive forms and functions of the body, have been thought of to produce differences in things like attitudes, temperaments, intelligences, and aptitudes between males and females. For instance, some studies suggest that in all human societies, boys tend to engage in more rough and tumble play, while girls tend to be more engaged in infant contact and care. These behaviors suggest that there's kind of basic biological determinants that might influence particular behaviors. This is generally what we think of as kind of sex, right? The behaviors that may be rooted in your actual biology and reproductive forms. But any conclusion about hardwired sex differences between men and women are really muddied by evidence that culture also shapes male and female preferences and behaviors. One of the reasons why cultural norms around gender often feel so natural is that they become embedded in our psyches at a really early age. In fact, studies show that by the age of 3, we've learned about the categories of gender in our culture and all of the kind of elaborate beliefs, behaviors, and meanings associated with each gender. So we can think about all these kind of beliefs, behaviors, and meanings as a gender ideology. So gender ideology refers to a lot of different things. For instance, what we might consider man's work versus women's work. So if we look at a kind of interesting counter study to how we might think of this in the US, we can go to Phyllis Kayberry's study of the Nassau Society in Cameroon. And she looked at this society in the 1940s. And what she found was that males in that culture argued that land preparation for crops was actually a woman's job, and that this kind of job was too strenuous for men, and that women could actually carry much heavier loads because they had stronger foreheads. So what's interesting about this case in Cameroon, right, is that the gender roles that are assigned to specific types of labor is actually counter to what we see here in a kind of European society, and that one of the rationales that Cameroonian men pointed to for why women were better at these kind of hard labor tasks was actually a biological feature or physiological feature, basically their ability to carry heavier loads on their foreheads. So another example of a gender ideology can revolve around what we consider masculine versus feminine. In North America, girls are often associated with the color pink, and boys are associated with the color blue. And this feels somewhat natural and obvious, or at least it has until very recently, when people have started to kind of challenge these gender conceptions. But this idea of pink is for girls, blue is for boys is completely artificial. Relatively few cultures associate a color with a particular gender. So American society is kind of unique in this regard. For example, in Hindu societies, Hindu deities are both male and female and are highly decorated and with lots of different colors, which makes them difficult to distinguish, at least by conventional ideas about masculinity. Margaret Mead is one of the first anthropologists to really distinguish between biological sex and all of these kind of cultural ideologies that revolve around gender roles. In her 1935 book, Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies, Mead analyzed sex in 3 different Papua New Guinean groups. What she argued in this book was that basically the distinction between sex and gender, biology, and cultural expectations was highly malleable and very specific to given societies. And this idea has become really influential in the next several generations of anthropologists to do work on things like gender roles. Today, anthropologists take what we could consider a biocultural perspective. They accept that this kind of male and female differences are shaped by a mix of biology, environmental conditions, but also sociocultural processes. So you likely already know from your high school health classes, right, that as a rule, nature divides humans into kind of 2 sexes for the purposes of reproduction. This division between male and female sexual organs in humans is referred to as sexual dimorphism. You can probably name some minor exceptions to this rule. For example, men with higher pitched voices, or women with facial hair, which is indicative of higher testosterone levels. But this is not enough to challenge certainties about male and female differences. On a more systematic kind of inspection, the division between males and females breaks down as variations in chromosomes, gonads, internal reproductive structures, hormones, and external genitalia become apparent. So in the scientific literature, individuals who diverge from this kind of male-female dichotomy are called intersex, meaning that they have sexual organs and functions somewhere between or including male and female elements. For instance, some individuals have both ovaries and testes, while others have gonad development with separate but not fully developed male and female organs. Some estimates put the frequency of intersex people in the United States at 1.7% of all live births, suggesting that intersex is actually much more common than rare, but highly recognizable. It's much more common than rare compared to other kinds of highly recognizable conditions like albinism, which happens in 1 in 20,000 births. This figure of 1.7%, or you can think of it as basically 2 out of every 100 births, isn't universal, of course, and rates of intersexuality vary between populations. For instance, Yupik people in Alaska have a higher rate of intersexual births than other populations. Doctors refer to intersexuality as congenital adrenal hyperplasia, a condition produced by genetic mutations that produce masculine genitalia in girls. European societies which construct sex as either male or female and focus on genitals as markers of sex have historically considered intersexuality abnormal, sometimes immoral, and have most recently turned it into a medical problem. In the US, most intersex children are treated shortly after birth with sex assignment surgery, in which doctors eliminate any genital ambiguity through surgery and counsel parents to raise the child to correspond with their new sexual assignment. In the reading that you guys have for today, Anne Fausto Sterling starts by describing an intersex Spanish hurdler named Maria Patino, who was actually barred from the Olympics in 1988 because she had a Y chromosome. So I'm curious to hear from the class. Should sex testing be allowed in the Olympics and other professional sports, given what we know so far about the frequency of intersexuality and the role that gender plays in the construction of identity? So go ahead, write down some notes if you're watching this, or go ahead and talk to your peers if you're in class. So the author of your reading, Anne Fausto Sterling, has argued that we should actually replace our two-sex system with a five-sex system. In addition to males and females, she argues that we should also accept the categories of herms, merms, and firms. Fausto Sterling's research caused a great deal of controversy among right-wing religious groups, perhaps unsurprisingly, who claimed that the two sexes were actually rooted in nature, as well as counselors, actually, of intersexual children who decried these kind of five categories as placing too much emphasis on social construction over biology. Since her original research article was published in 1993, the debate over cultural conceptions of gender has escalated, and the boundaries separating male and female seems harder than ever to define. To be clear, the decisions involved in kind of sex assignment surgeries are rarely medical. Instead, they derive from culturally accepted notions about how a boy or girl should look. Surgeons create realistic-looking genitalia by removing body parts and using plastic surgery to construct appropriate genitalia. The trouble with this idea of appropriate genitalia is that there's actually no biological standard for genital size or shape. So what normal or appropriate means is entirely dependent on your perspective. The goal of these kind of intersex surgeries is for the genitals' size and shape to convince others, particularly, parents, caretakers, and other children, future partners, that the person is either male or female. Sex assignment surgery shows that sex is not simply a biological phenomena, but quite literally constructed based on cultural assumptions. The assumption being, right, that sex is a dichotomy, and that there are notions of what appropriate or ideal male and female should look like. These surgeries have become pretty controversial, as many intersex people and their allies have spoken out against their treatment, sometimes describing it as a form of mutilation. In other cultures, anatomical features such as genitalia aren't the dominant factors in constructing a gender or sex identity. In some societies, people live their lives as neither male nor female and have a culturally accepted and in some cases prestigious social pathway. Anthropologists call this gender variance, basically expressions of sex and gender that diverge from the male-female norms that dominate in most societies. Gender variance has often been entangled in debates about sexuality, which encompasses sexual preferences, desires, and practices. Sexual preferences intersect in complex ways with gender variance. People everywhere establish their gender sex identities through social performance, like wearing certain clothes, speaking and moving in certain culturally prescribed ways, or performing certain gender roles. So one example of gender variance that we can point to in the anthropological literature is that of Hijras. So in India, Hijras are a third gender who have a special social status based on their devotion to Bakaura Mata, a mother goddess worshipped throughout India. Hijras are defined as males who are sexually impotent either because they were born intersex or because they underwent castration. Because they lack male genitals, Hijras are viewed as man minus man. They are also sometimes seen as male plus female because they dress and talk like women, take on women's occupations, and act like women in other ways, although they often act like women in these kind of exaggerated burlesque ways. Individuals become Hijras from many religious backgrounds, but their special status emerges from the positive meaning that Hinduism specifically attributes to people who embody the male and female characteristics. In Hindu theology, males and females exist in complementary opposition. For instance, the Hindu deities Shiva, Vishnu, and Krishna have dual gender manifestations. They also manifest themselves as non-human entities. The female principle within these deities is active, both kind of giving and destructive, while the male principle is inert or latent. By becoming Hijras, men can tap into the benefits and destructive powers of these female principles as vehicles of the mother goddess, giving them the ability to both bless and issue curses. Hijras live in communes of up to 20 people led by a guru, and they live outside of kind of normal social bounds, having renounced their caste position and kinship obligations. Their primary social role is to provide blessings when a boy is born or for a couple's fertility during wedding ceremonies. At these social events, Hijras put on a show. They make crude jokes, and they often perform burlesque dances. Although it is stigmatized within the Hijra community, some people actually work as prostitutes, engaging in sex acts with men. However, it's important to note that Hijra prostitutes are not considered homosexual within Indian society. Unlike in Western cultures, Indian society doesn't consider human sexuality as a dichotomy between homosexuality and heterosexuality. Although British colonialism in the 19th and 20th centuries tried to outlaw Hijras, they continued to exist largely by conducting their initiation rites in secret. And they also continue to exist today because the Indian gender system still considers this combination of male and female as both valid, meaningful, and powerful. Like Hijras in the United States, drag queens challenge heteronormative gender guidelines. Although drag queens merely reflect kind of the pre-existing image of a woman, they still present an image of both gender bending and the ways that gender is socially taught. Drag queens take gender characteristics from both the heterosexual and LGBTQI communities in order to create their persona, self-identity, and their stage performances. Drag queens expose gender as merely a social construction through these performances where they kind of possess these dual roles, where they both undo heteronormative gender ideals and they also reinforce current heteronormative social ideals about what femininity looks like in terms of stylized hair, makeup, clothing, and body language. While drag queens may look, act, and sound like women, they have a wide range of gender identities. Hyperfemininity is a term often associated with drag queens based on their often large wigs, makeup, and other feminine accessories. So you can think about RuPaul as the kind of pinnacle of hyperfemininity in drag queens. An ethnographic study of drag queens in an Appalachian college town by sociocultural anthropologist Caitlin Grief indicates that labeling drag queens as hyperfeminine actually overlooks crucial identity information about their gender identity. Grief's interviewees agreed that their choices in hair, makeup, and fashion are part of who they are and how they express their identity, similar to anyone else. But they also said that drag identity consists of more than wearing big wigs and makeup and feminine clothing. Instead of being hyper-feminine, drag queens in her study take these kind of pre-existing social images of a woman in order to create and perform their own drag persona. Anthropologist Judith Butler has argued that because gender is simply a performance, gender characteristics can't actually be over-exaggerated. So you can't actually be hyper-feminine or hyper-masculine because everything is a performance. The social construction of gender results in the inability for anyone to truly express these kind of hyper characteristics. Some drag queens possess the ability to what's called pass in their persona. According to Robin Maltz, to pass effectively as a subject is to basically be misread as real. So even though not all drag queens have the ability to pass, it may not always be due to their masculine physical features. Social acceptance of one's gender appearance determines one's passability in that gender. As drag queens use pre-existing feminine gender qualities, they are accepted or denied with that gender. So for example, if you're a drag queen that is embracing a very specific feminine identity, how closely you map on to that feminine identity will determine whether you pass as feminine, right? In the same way that if you're a drag queen that may present as butch or masculine, your passability will be based on how you map on to looking quote unquote butch. So in their personas, drag queens who identify as female and present a kind of female identity will receive reactions based on how closely their performance matches our expectations of what women should look like. Outside of the kind of drag club or show, without the drag persona on, their treatment and reactions to them will revert back to our society's treatment of men, often of homosexual men. In other words, genitals do not make one socially a female or male. It is the gender box we live in that consciously constructs our gender identity. Gender identity is self-defined while also being affected by public culture. We are socially taught to assume that one's sex and/or sexuality is based on the gender characteristics one is performing. Such assumptions are exemplified by the fact that many people assume that all drag queens are trans. For instance, a self-identified butch lesbian interviewed in Gates' study assumed that all queens were transsexual. You can see the interviewee's comment, Sarah, here. Sarah's comments suggest that people assume drag queens want to be women because they present a female gender identity. When asked about whether people assumed that she, Sarah, was transsexual based on her masculine gender appearance, she responded, no. Sarah's response indicates that she does not see herself as completely passing as a man, although others may. By identifying as a butch lesbian and wearing male gender clothing, people must re-examine her appearance on the gender, sex, and sexuality binary spectrum. These socially taught and enforced binary spectrums determine to what extent one's gender is considered passing. For example, Sarah is performing a masculine gender role, but only to an extent. She still presents female gender characteristics, such as having long hair and referring to herself with female pronouns. By performing a masculine gender role with some female gender characteristics, her gender appearance can lead individuals to identify her as lesbian. On the other hand, drag queens go beyond this by using female pronouns when referring to themselves and other drag queens. These social factors often lead to misconceptions that drag queens match their gender to their sex and sexuality. So we can think about gender as kind of a set of traits that are used similarly to an accessory in order to express an individual identity. And gender is definitely not static. For instance, a trans man named Martin explains how he identifies himself with various social labels and categories. Martin's self-identification as both transgendered and queer reflects Judith Butler's argument regarding the body as its place of performance. By presenting gender as a performance, drag queens deconstruct essentialist views of gender and sex. Drag queen performances attract a variety of people, including people who identify as heterosexual men. Drag queens also work to undermine the divide between heterosexual and homosexuality by deliberately working to arouse desires outside of audiences' claimed sexual identity. This trend has been explained by some queens as a result of this kind of utopian fun atmosphere that's created at drag shows. Basically saying that that drag shows are a space in which everyone, not just queens, can start to reconceptualize or think about their sexuality and their sexual identities in different ways. The start of shows like RuPaul's Drag Race and Orange is the New Black have made mainstream culture aware of queer bodies and made them more normal in the public's eyes. These shows demonstrate how change can occur through the use of positive media exposure, visual teachings about identity, and LGBTQI awareness. So there's a couple of key things to take away from our conversation about drag queens, hijras, and gender. So the first is that drag queens provide an understanding that gender is both a social construction and a performance. The second big thing to take away here is that drag queens, through their personas and performances, continue the heteronormative cycle of male-female gender roles and images. Drag queens are breaking the social rules and roles that feminine gender characteristics can only be performed by women. However, the image they choose to perform does not break the kind of overall social ideal of what a woman looks like. Ultimately, in the case studies I've talked about today, they show how gender identity and sexuality will never truly be static, but are constantly changing over time. All right, that's all I have for you today. The D2L quiz question, what color are the pyramids of Giza? The answer is pink. So today the answer is pink. Make sure to go on to D2L and fill out that quiz if you are watching this online. All right, have a good spring break, everyone.